Hello, everyone, and welcome back. So last time we were talking about Thrasymachus, and basically just to conclude what I was saying, my point was, if you think about it, Thrasymachus, he doesn't so much offer a definition of what justice is, as he defines it away, isn't it? Because essentially he's arguing, well, justice is just whatever the strongest group says it is, right? So he's essentially saying that um, there is no ultimate notion of good and bad, right? There is no way we can define what is just or what is fair and what is right and what is wrong. It ends up just being circumstantial. That's the point, right? It's just whatever the group in charge says it is. Might is right. So he's not really defining justice at all. And although I've said this last time that he would be very influential, that Hobbes and Machiavelli would have some um, similar ideas in terms of people's morality, right? They would think similar to Thrasymachus here. At the end of the day, he is not really explaining what justice is, right? Okay. Now, moving on. Each of these three justice visions of justice that we've seen, and each one of these three characters we've seen so far played a different role in the Republic, right? Socrates is trying to get rid of three things. First, he gets rid of Cephalus and the old ancient beliefs, the ideas of piety and sacrifice to the gods, right? The idea that to be a good person, so in order to go to heaven, you need to sacrifice animals, etc. Those ancient ideas, right? Um, that Cephalus believes in, right? And when Cephalus leaves the stage in the dialogue, says, "Okay, I gotta go." That represents, right, the old traditions, going, right, leaving the scene, and philosophy entering the scene. That's what it's supposed to represent. That philosophy or science is substituting those religious, traditional, divine ideas about sacrifice and piety, etc. Right. So that's the first role that the first character plays, and that's the first thing Socrates gets rid of. Then with his son Polemarchus, he's not appealing to God or to the divine, but he's appealing to Simonides, to authority, right? It's like as if you and it's the same as to use a one more, because Simonides were obviously is not someone we're very familiar with. But to use a more contemporary example, think about Einstein, right? Someone who's very famous, right? Newton or Einstein. So it's the same. What Socrates is doing here is saying, well, just because Socrates or just because any person said something, Einstein or whoever that person is, that doesn't necessarily mean that that thing must be true and forever true, right? We should always be searching for the truth, and finding it for ourselves. Socrates believes that you can only see the truth if you see it for yourself. It's useless to just take it for granted what other people say, right? And that's what Paul Marcus is doing, because when he joins the conversation, he says, well, according to Simon, it is. That's what it is. That's what justice is. And Socrates is going to try to debunk, this idea. That's the second thing that he's going to debunk. We shouldn't be just in awe to certain ideas that are accepted. We should challenge everything all the time. So that's the second role, the role of authority, and that's the second thing that Socrates dismisses as the conversation progresses, as we progress through the first book, right? Um, and through Thrasymachus, which is the most challenging of the so far. He's a sophist, right? So the sophist is a professor in a teacher, if you will, in ancient Greece. And Socrates was also a teacher, right? But a different kind of teacher. Socrates didn't really see himself as a teacher. He'll say that in the Apology, that he never saw himself as a teacher. He doesn't think he's a teacher because he doesn't think he knows anything, right? That's his most famous idea of Socrates, right? All I know is that I don't know anything, right? He's essentially saying, well, truth is so complicated, right? Listen, if you try to actually understand what justice is and explain it, right? Maybe we'll spend our whole lives here debating and not really get to a final conclusion about how to perfectly define it. And that's what Socrates did. He spent his whole life debating people and trying to understand what these basic concepts meant, justice, virtue, etc. But he didn't charge for lectures. He didn't get any money. He basically just lived, off of people's donations. People would buy him, food and invite him for dinner, etc., for restaurants, etc. So they would buy him food, etc. And he would, just spend his days teaching people, but from his perspective, he was chatting with people. It just happened that he was the wisest man in that group, right? So um, he could have been the most insightful of the group, but he wasn't necessarily the teacher. The same way Thrasymachus would have been the sophist, right? And the sophist was a teacher, like traditionally the way we see it now, a teacher that would teach philosophy and rhetoric, and Socrates, in a way, is competing against Thrasymachus for the attention of the young, right? People of Athens, which are Polemarchus and Adeimantus and Glaucon that we will look at later, especially Glaucon. But these young fellow, they were all learning from Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus was their teacher, and then Socrates is sort of competing with Thrasymachus and trying to show a um, different way, right, of approaching these questions, which is completely different. Now, Thrasymachus, sometimes people will associate him with the so-called a moralist challenge, right? Which is his idea. Why would you be moral? Why would you be good if it pays off to be selfish? We'll talk about that later. But that's what I meant earlier, that he is to some extent a forerunner of Hobbes and Machiavelli. Okay. All right, so that's about it for this slide. So these are the first visions of justice I wanted to talk about: Cephalus, Polemarchus, and Thrasymachus. But they're pretty straightforward, aren't they? I mean, Cephalus's and Polemarchus's definition are quite simple, right? And I think, well, remember the definitions. Obviously, you can go back to the first class and watch it again. But if you remember, paying your debts, right, speaking the truth, that was Cephalus, and then Polemarchus said, you should help your friends and harm your enemies. Um, and these definitions are very simple, and they come quite obviously as probably too simple for a complete definition of justice, right? Probably they can even be part of what justice is. Maybe it is just to speak the truth. Probably it is, right? Not always, right? There will be situations when you shouldn't speak the truth, right? But most times you should speak the truth, and most times you should pay back your debt, unless your friend went crazy, like the example Socrates came up with, right? With Paul Marcus' example, you should help your friends. That also sounds very virtuous. It's not very objectionable. Then harming your enemies, of course, is the part that is a little bit more debatable, right? Many people disagree with that. But they were very simple definitions, and they're kind of easy to criticize because you can see, well, they're a bit simplistic and we need to add a bunch more stuff here to get a better definition of justice, right? They're not very encompassing. And then the third one, which is Thrasymachus, it's really a non-definition, right? If justice is, right, whatever the stronger wills, then there is no real concept of justice, right? In that sense of Thrasymachus, the whole justice system and the laws, they're just a facade, really, right? They're just a belief system for such that for the weak and the poor to think that they have access and they have rights, but indeed they don't, according to Thrasymachus. So the justice system wouldn't even be necessary at that point. Probably it would just exist so people don't rebel and stuff like that, right? If it's always for the advantage of the strong, what's the point in making laws even, right? Unless you'd argue, well, it's just for so people think that they have rights, but they don't actually have rights. So it's kind of, if you go through that avenue you can try to explain it, but it's not really getting into the concept of justice. Um, all right, now we will for the remainder of the class, we will talk about two more visions of justice. That's what I want to do today. One of them is Socrates or Plato's. I'm going to just treat them interchangeably. I've explained that before, right? Obviously, we have nothing written by Socrates. So Socrates here is a character of Plato's book. But Socrates, having been Plato's teacher, I do believe that Socrates, the character, is quite similar to Socrates, the man. And I also think that the philosophy of Plato is quite inspired by Socrates' thought. But so, for the sake of simplification here, we'll look at Plato's vision, okay, of justice. But I'm just going to argue that Socrates, the character, represents Plato in the Republic, right? He's just representing Plato here, as it were. This is an oversimplification of the book, but we don't have time to talk about it in at length. But my point is, I want to give you the overall the overarching story in the Republic. That's the last thing we're going to do. And I also want to talk about the another vision of justice, which is that of Glaucon, which we didn't talk about yet. Now, before we do that, we start with Plato's cave. Now, the cave, you're only going to find it later on the book, on the second half of the book, on chapter 6 and 7. So obviously you're not going to read that. But it's important to understand the Plato's idea, right? The book and Plato's vision of justice. Now, the allegory, you see the cave here. The idea is that imagine people here in a cave, right? So you see the prisoners here, and they can see the shadow of the spectacle, and there's a man, the cave dweller, who's walking over here with puppets or whatever, and you have the light projecting the shadow here on the wall, right? And this is an allegory. You can think about it as a metaphor, as you will. He's trying to explain to us that most people in society, right? In other words, everyone except the philosopher, that's where he's trying to get it. So most of us, except the philosopher, except the intellectuals, the scientists, right? People who, overcome these limitations, end up not seeing the real world, the real forms as they are. We just see these projections. We never see the real animals as they exist, only a representation of it, right? And that's basically because our intellectual senses are not developed to understand the true forms of everything. Okay, that's roughly the idea. You can see here, there's an exit to the cave, right? And you can go to the land of philosophia. So in the book, in this, in the story, there's a captive. You see the captive here who gets rid, right, of the ties, and he walks away and he leaves the cave. He sees the light and he sees everything outside, and it's so beautiful. At first, he can't see anything. Obviously, he's blind because it's so bright, and then little by little, finally see the shapes of flowers and what bees actually look like in real life and how beautiful they are and how they've just been living, through this illusion, right? Without being able to appreciate the true reality of things as they actually are. If you could see the essence of things, right? That's what you would see once you left the cave. And so the prisoner goes back to the cave and etc. And but try to convince the other prisoners of what's outside, etc. But now the point is this: what is this supposed to represent? This is Plato's theory of knowledge, right? So his idea is there is, as it were, this other sort of metaverse. You can think about it as this other plane, okay, this other dimension, right? Which is this realm of ideas, right? Where the essence of things live. The essence of everything is there. To give an example, when I say a computer, all of us know what it is, right? Probably most of us are using a computer to watch this lecture. Maybe you're using your phone, but let me assume you're all using your computer. When I say a computer, all of you are looking at a computer and seeing a computer, but Each computer is different, isn't it? At least, you may have added some stickers to your computer, or maybe the color is different, it's a different brand, etc., different size. Each computer in real life is different from one another. But when I say the word computer, we all know what it is, right? And Plato is saying there's a concept of what a computer is, which is like beyond the material existence of computers, right? The concept of computer exists outside of the cave. Okay, so each computer that we have is just one representation of something, but outside, right, in this metaverse and this other plane, um, where the essence of everything is, you have the idea of the computer there, as it were, the perfect computer, as it were, right? Perfect, simply not in the way that it's the best computer ever, but because it perfectly represents what a computer is, right? Without being material even, right? Um, you can think about a chair. If I say a chair, you know what a chair is, right? But it's not because you're thinking about a specific thing. You might even imagine a specific chair when I say the chair, but you can use several different types of chairs, right? You can picture different types of chairs in your mind, wooden chairs, metal chairs, whatever kinds of chairs. Um, and so the point is that you know what a chair is. A chair is something that you can sit on and you can relax, isn't it? If you're tired, it's more comfortable to sit down than to stand up if you're tired, etc. So you can sit there to watch TV or to study or to do whatever. So the chair, right, is obviously it's a material thing, but there's also a representation, an idea of the chair, which you know in your mind, right? Due to the functions that it performs. That's the essence of the chair. You see the point? So Plato essentially uses this allegory to explain that we everything we see in the world can be a little bit deceiving. But if we go through intense learning, okay, and in the Republic, right, people would go through 50 years of learning actually until they became the philosopher king or the philosopher queen, which would be the people who are able to see the essence and the forms of things and not be deceived just by the appearances of the appearance of things, right? So in this political society, the republic, it would be led by philosopher kings and philosopher queens. Philosopher queens and queens would be the smartest people of society. When you're young, you go to school and you go through tests. That's what Plato envisioned, right? And then the smartest people would be selected, but they would go through years and years and years of studying until, and then by 50, they would, there's like several stages, of course, of this learning, and from 30 to 50, you're already engaged in politics and in the administration of the city. But when you become 50, you'd be old enough and smart enough to be a king or a queen, right? Basically, the president. You can think about it like that. Not a president, because it would be more actually like a parliament. Let me take that back, right? Not just one person, but a group of people running the country. Okay, so a parliament, like in England, that's a better way to understand it. Without the prime minister, probably. I mean, a group of people. Okay, it doesn't really matter. The point is, you could reach enlightenment, okay, intellectual enlightenment, right, by studying and learning. What is just these kinds of discussions that you read in the Republic. So what the different ways of different kinds of virtue and how to be virtuous and what justice. So learning moral philosophy, and then studying politics, etc. Um, okay. Now, why is this so important? The first sense of the book, when it begins, and Socrates says, "I went down to Paris yesterday with Glaucon." Right? I want to explain you something about this. This is related to the cave. Okay, we'll go back to the cave now in this next slide. But before we go to the cave, this is Google Maps here. So you need to understand that when he says, "I went down," he's going from Athens to Paris, which is the port. It's still the same nowadays. If you Next time you go to Athens, if you're up for a 5.5 mile walk, you can do it in about 2 hours, according to Google. Probably a bit less because it always overestimates a little bit, doesn't it? Um, Google Map, I don't really know, but okay. Either way, you can see here that it's not like you're going downhill a lot, but you see that it is right. Here's the ocean, and Athens is a little bit a cliff, right? So going down to Paris means geographically, literally going down from the hill to the sea, right? It's a geographical reference. You know, if you've been to Athens around here, is where you have the Acropolis and etc. Even if you've seen or if you've seen pictures, you know that it's a bit of a hill, isn't it? Where you have the Acropolis, etc. So um the idea is it is going down geographically in that sense, but it also means something else. Okay, that's what I want to explain. Going down, the word he uses here, katabasis. That word katabasis is often used in Greek literature at the time. Okay, the Greek epics. It's used as going under. Okay, going to the underworld. That's the idea. So here on the right side, you have the underworld, right? Both of these are the underworld. Okay, in ancient Greece, they had this idea of the underworld. But either way, going down. Okay, this word katabasis. It's clear if you compare it with other Greek authors that Plato is there's a double meaning here, right? His intention is to explain that going from Athens, where the philosophers were, so Socrates and Plato, and they're hanging around here, and they have the school and they're studying whatever. And Pyrrhus was seen as a stronghold of democracy at the time, right? And you know that Socrates will end up being killed by this democracy, right? He'll be tried to that. So going down is also going down intellectually, going down the cave, all right? So that's what he's signaling at. Socrates is the philosopher, and he's the smart person who lives in Athens and whatever. And he's going to Paris with Glaucon, and he's going down to engage with people which are not philosopher kings like himself. Okay, so that's the point. That's the symbol here of that very first sentence. And the very first book and the very first page are so important, and even the very first sentence of the Republic, because the Republic is structured in a very intricate way. And the first book, it's really self-contained. There was a debate among German scholars, and I'm not sure what's the status of this discussion now, but there was a debate at one point that the first book of the Republic was supposed to actually be a separate dialogue, like the other dialogues that we're going to read, right? We're going to read Crito and Apology, which are separate short dialogues, very short ones, not like the Republic, which is a bit longer. So some people believe that that book one would have been written as a separate book and called Thrasymachus, actually, right? Because that's the main interlocutor of Plato there, or of Socrates rather. So this book, it represents the main ideas of Platonic philosophy, right? It's self-contained. It ended up being the first chapter of the first book of the whole book, right? Of the Republic. So the first chapter, I mean, in the way we call it now. But it's quite self-contained, so it helps you understand the whole idea of the book, right? Although we're not reading the whole book. Yeah, and that's and the other thing I wanted to say is that it's also structured as a symphony. So if you know how a symphony works, for the first minutes or so, there's the theme is announced, right? So there's going to be a sequence of musical notes, right? Some melody, that opening melody that's going to be the theme of that symphony, right? And then for the rest of the symphony, that theme is going to be developed in various different ways, and you're going to modulate and change the octave and change the, right? Change the harmony from a major to a minor. You're going to make all kinds of modulations and change that initial theme, and perhaps you at points in the symphony you can barely even recognize the initial theme, but it's the whole symphony is centered around that initial theme, and it just expresses it in several different ways. Okay, and the Republic is also a little bit like that. So the first page of the Republic, the first book, but even the first page. Shows you all of these main themes, and you can get a good grasp of what the Republic or at least an initial idea, a good grasp, maybe I exaggerated, but you can get an initial idea of what Republic is about. So let's look at that very first page and I'll tell you what these themes are. After he says, I went down, and I'm underlining here these things and these very important things, I guess, in the Republic. So just stress them. So after he said that he went down with Glaucon, he tells us that Polemarchus, the son of Cephalus, ordered his slave boy to run after us. So it says, Polemarchus orders you to wait. Well, Polemarchus said, do you see how many of us there are? Either prove stronger than these men or stay here. And then Socrates says, well, isn't there another possibility? Can't we persuade you that, right? Does it have to go that way? You're ordering us. Can we just talk about it? What if we persuade you, right? Isn't that a possibility? And then Paul Marr says something very interesting. Could you really persuade us if we don't listen? That is, how do you talk with someone that doesn't have ears, right? That's basically what he's saying metaphorically here, that you can't talk with guns, right? Look at how many of us there are. We have the power, right? We have a bunch of, so, the obviously Paul Marcus has slave boys, right? So he's obviously rich. Cephalus is rich here, is like a merchant or whatever, and then Paul Marcus is obviously, his son, so he's also wealthy. He has slaves, so he's rich, right? I mentioned that Socrates, he didn't have any wealth at all. He didn't have a job or anything. He didn't charge for his lessons. So he basically just walked around the city having debates, and people, basically help him, like invite him for lunch and dinner, and that's my understanding of how he got by, because he never had a job. So how did he even eat? Although he also had kids and a wife, so yeah, he must have gotten some money somehow, I guess. I don't know, or they worked themselves, the kids and the wife. I don't know. But there's not much information about those details. But he didn't actually work formally, at least. He probably got money off his disciples and friends. Right now that because of course Plato was his student, and all these people, and some of them were rich. Plato was well off, so probably although he didn't charge, right? He didn't charge like say $100, right? Whatever the currency is. They probably, right, gave him donations, and he probably accept those, because otherwise, I mean, how would he survive, right? But okay, but moving on. So could you persuade us if we don't listen? And Glaucon said, well, it seems we must say stay. And Socrates says, well, if it is so resolved, then that's how we must act. So if you think about this throughout this whole first page here, what is it that Socrates does here? Nothing, right? He doesn't do anything. He's not doing any of the action. He's just obedient, right? He says, well, if that's how it has to be, right? That's how it is, right? That's how we must act. He's not. Socrates in Plato's Republic is the smartest, supposed to represent the smartest intellectual, right, that ever lived, etc. Like the greatest philosopher ever, the most just man ever. That's how we think of Socrates. Um, um, and yet, the smartest person, right, the person who knows more, is the person who has no say here, right? Essentially, what this first page is supposed to show you is, in a political order which is corrupted, um, Socrates has to obey a person that has power, right? A person who owns slaves. Look at how many of us there are here. Prove stronger or stay here. So in a political order, right, with political institutions that are not healthy, you end up with this result that the philosopher is not allowed to be a philosopher because Socrates really doesn't want to be here, right? Isn't there another possibility that we must go? I mean, he wants to go and get done with his, go back to his stuff, right? He does not want to be there and he's forced into it. So this page is so important because it's announcing you this, this tension between order, the political power here on the one hand, and the intellectual power on the other hand, right? And how useless it could be to be virtuous and just and smart simply if you're living in a regime where those qualities, you're not allowed to develop those qualities. Okay. Yeah. So, that's why I underline these words because I think they show quite clearly what's going to happen later, also, and what you can see later in the apology, right? You got to read this, keeping in mind that Socrates will eventually be killed by this republic, right? Socrates, at the end of the day, he was trialed and he didn't really try very hard to persuade. We'll talk about that next week and you'll see, or next video. But he was trialed, right? And he didn't persuade people, wasn't it? I mean, at the end of the day, he was sentenced to death. So when there is a dominant group, right? Reason doesn't matter anymore. That's the whole point here, right? Then it is order what matters, and it is whoever has the biggest guns. You cannot reason with guns. That's going to be the one of the central points of the republic that are trying to explain what is the right political configuration that will allow that will allow reason and persuasion and these things to flourish, right? In a perfect city, in other words, in a perfect city, people should be allowed to persuade one another as long as they are smart enough and they have good arguments, right? But in a not perfect city like Athens, you can't persuade someone else because that person will not listen to you, because that person does not have to listen to you, because that person has slave boys, right? Look at how many of us there are. So you have a bunch of slaves that will imprison, right? So you have an army or a militia or whatever. So you don't have to argue anything and you don't have to reason and you don't have to be intellectual about things, right? That's the point. And that's because of the political institutions, which are faulty. All right. Okay. Now, now at book two, jumping to book two, because now I want to move to Glaucon, because I mentioned earlier, we've already seen three of the visions of justice. We still need to see two more visions of justice, Glaucon, and finally Plato, which I'm just going to, of course, you'd have to read the whole book, but I'll show you more or less what it would look like. Now, Glaucon, when he, in his exchange with Socrates, he says, Socrates, do you want to seem to have persuaded us or truly persuade us that it is in every way to be better to be just than unjust? First, I'll tell you what kind of thing they say justice is and where it came from. Second, that all those who practice it do so unwillingly as necessary but not good. Third, that it is fitting that they do so, for the life of the unjust man is, after all, far better than that of the just. Okay, so a few things to say here. The moralist challenge, the thing I've been talking about, I connected that with Thrasymachus, right? That's the Thrasymachus argument. The life of the unjust man is better than the just man because, right, if it is true that might is right, that justice is just for the advantage of the stronger, as Thrasymachus argues, then it's better to be unjust than just. There's no point. Just, be unjust and be corrupt and try to take over the country or whatever. That's the moralist challenge. Why would you be just if being unjust benefits you? That's our moralist challenge. But the other point I want to make here, and that's why I stress these words, seem, do you want to seem to, or do you want to truly persuade us? That's the idea of the cave that I mentioned before, right? So the difference between seeming and being the truth of something, the essence of thing, right? That's so important, the ripple that keeps popping everywhere. It's a little bit, if you just read it like that, you probably wouldn't notice it, right? Especially because, I mean, if you're reading it for the first time, you didn't even, right? You only meet the allegory of the cave later on the book, so you wouldn't even know the allegory of the cave at that point, and that's why I explained it to you first. There, right, in the cave, you have that idea of things seem a certain way in the cave because you're just seeing the shades, right? You're like, you're not seeing reality as it actually is, the essence of reality, and you're prejudiced or you don't have enough information, etc., etc. And as you progress, right, up the cave, right, um, as you progress, there's this idea of seeing the essence of things and the reality of things, right? So he asks Socrates, do you want to seem or do you want to truly persuade it? And Socrates said, no, I want to truly persuade us because for him, that's very important because of this idea of the cave. That's what he's actually looking at, right? For the sophist, for Thrasymachus, it wouldn't really matter. Thrasymachus would say, it doesn't matter to me if you seem or if you truly are persuaded. As long as you act as if you were persuaded, that's what matters, right? So for a sophist, that's what Socrates is also trying to get rid of that I was talking about earlier. For a sophist, what matters are results and consequences and the appearance of things. So if I want to be president, as long as I can get you to vote for me, that's all that matters, right? Regardless of whether you think that I'm a good person or not, I just want you to vote for me. So that would be the Thrasymachus, right? The sort of moralist idea here. Um, but to Socrates, to Plato, on the other hand, no. It's not just the consequences that matter, the action, the effects of the actions that matter, but the true essence of things. They're trying to understand reality, right? Not just to win any kind of political game, but to understand the essence of things. So that's why he asks that question. He phrases it like that. Do you want to seem to or truly to? All right. Now, he moves on, right? And he says, I'm going to explain you what justice is when the genesis of justice, right? Where does it come from? The origins of it. And Glaucon's story goes like this, basically. Well, the individual is selfish, is going to argue that everyone would be a little bit following Thrasymachus and the moralist challenge. Initially, he says, yes, everyone would be tyrants if they could, everyone would be immoral. But the thing that people notice is that suffering hurts more than happiness gives you pleasure in absolute terms, if that makes any sense. So, for instance, if you find $100 bills, if you find $100 in $100 in the floor, that's great, isn't it? And if you lose $100, that's awful, right? Basically saying losing these $100 is a lot worse in absolute terms than finding those $100 all out of sudden. There's some behavioral economists and actually in experiments that actually show that this is indeed the case, that um, the joy of winning something in absolute terms is less than the than the pain of losing that same amount of that thing. Um, so basically, he's saying, well, look, yes, people are selfish in principle, but what they find out is that in a world without rules or one day I'm going to get the advantage over you and that would be great, but the next day you'll get the advantage over me and that's not going to be great, right? And people are going to do that, but then if we keep doing that, on average we're all worse off because one unit of suffering, right, it's greater in absolute terms because it's a negative number, right? So one unit of suffering hurts more than one unit of happiness gives you pleasure, right? That $100, if you lose it or if you get it, it's not the same, psychologically speaking, it's not the same effect on your brain. It could, some people could argue, well, earning $100 or losing $100 should be the same, right? In absolute terms, but they are not. And Glaucon, he doesn't use this expression that justice is a social contract, but that's essentially what he is hinting at here, right? That people, that justice then emerges. That's the genesis of justice, according to Glaucon, the origins of justice. He's saying essentially the opposite of Thrasymachus, because justice is not for the advantage of the stronger, but actually it's for the benefit of the weaker, he's saying, right? Because if being harmed, in order to prevent people from being harmed, you create justice because we realize that we are all worse off in a system where there is, where there isn't a law system or anything like that. So he's been followed by Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Rousseau, this idea of social contract theory, and that's what we'll look at later, week 3, week 4. So I'm not going to talk about this right now, but that's where it comes from. I'm only going to talk about Hobbes to explain to you a little bit more this idea. I think it's easier to understand what Glaucon is saying, this idea of unit of pleasure and unit of suffering, etc. What basically he's saying is, let's think about it like this now, because Hobbes will be a little bit similar. He's going to say that this homo homini lupus, homo is man and lupus is wolf. So he's saying a man is to a man a wolf. Okay, a man is a wolf to another man. Like we will just devour each other and eat each other up like wolves. Okay, we're selfish and trying to get the better off of each other. That's the idea of Thomas Hobbes and Leviathan. And so he comes with this idea of the Leviathan, right? You know, a powerful king or a prince or whatever, some central authority to coordinate society. Because if left to their own, people will just kill themselves, right? That's a little bit similar to what Glaucon is saying. You see, in order to prevent people from hurting each other because it's so painful, right? If you don't have a police system, you don't have laws, you don't have anything, people could just break into your house all the time, and right, steal your stuff, kill you, hurt you, whatever. So in order to prevent these, people acting out as wolves, you need the central authority. You see, That's what Glaucon is saying here. Just as a social contract to protect people, because otherwise, they will all be tyrants and just kind of kill each other, right? And we'll be worse off. Okay, if Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays I take the better of you, and then Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday you take the better of me, and then Sunday we rest, we don't do anything, whatever. So 3 days I get the better of you, and 3 days you get the better of me. You could think we're equal, right? No, Glaucon say we're both negative, we're both doing worse off, right? If I win 3 times and I lose 3 times, my final result is not 0, but it's -1 or -2, because losing hurts more than winning gives you pleasure. You see, that's the whole point here. Okay, score. Okay, hopefully this is a little bit clearer now. I think Leviathan and this idea of homo homini lupus, maybe because it's so connected to Glaucon, and that maybe it's a little bit easier for you to understand. It's just an example, I guess. All right. So that's the thing I mentioned before, right? Losing $100 hurts more than finding $100 gives you joy. Okay. You can think about it. It's true though, because obviously it's financially it's the same, right? You would think it's just plus 100 and minus 100, so they add up to 0. You would think, but the point is, why is it that losing 100 hurts more than 100 gives you joy? Because, well, when you're, for instance, assume you're going somewhere and you have that money in your pocket and you lose that money, right? And then you get to that place and you walk hours and hours in ancient Greece or whatever. You walked hours and hours, and then when you got there, you're like, oh no, I don't have the money. I lost it on my way. So you have to walk back miles and miles and miles to go to the bank again to right to withdraw another $100 to go back to the store. And so you lost hours of your day. Maybe you lost your whole day on top of the $100, right? Now, if you find $100, it's great. You found $100, but you didn't get anything extra. You see the point? As opposed to when you lost it, you lost other things on top of the money. That's obviously just, I'm cherry picking. It's one example I came up with. Just so it's not a proof, an ultimate proof. But there is a lot of empirical evidence, psychological experiments that people actually do behave like that. Okay, so that does seem to be corroborated by psychology. Um, on top of my silly example, which is just supposed to show you why that could be the case. Maybe there are other things that come together with losing the hundred. For instance, another one: if you lose the $100, right, you're going to spend some hours opening, checking every pocket. That's for sure. I've done that. Who hasn't it, right? When you lose some money, then you're checking the pockets of all of your pets and all of everything you have, right? You're opening it. If you lose something, you're opening up all of the drawers. You're checking your whole house, isn't it? So you're losing a lot of time there, right? When you find something, right, you just find it, and that's great. You don't get extra time as a benefit or anything like that, right? So the idea here really, I mean, is that just is it helps the weaker, isn't it? It protects them from suffering. It's the opposite of Thrasymachus, really, I would argue. Although Glaucon starts the dialogue and it seems like he's gonna go on the same direction as Thrasymachus, he said, no, 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 it seems like he's going in that direction, but he actually arrives at a quite different conclusion, and it would be roughly the opposite, I would argue. Okay. So it's going to say, Socrates, you need a proof that justice is desirable in itself, not just for its consequences, right? And he uses the ring of Gyges here. He says, I'm going to give you an example. The ring of Gyges is this ring. It's the same idea as the Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings copied this idea from the Republic. So the ring of Gyges is a ring that when you turn it inside out, you become invisible. Okay. And then Glaucon, basically says, well, there was this kingdom, and this person got this key, this ring, and that person used that ring, and king is layered the king, and etc., and became the king, and he's saying, Socrates, any person who found a ring like that he could become invisible, um, would do horrible things. Basically, that's Glaucon's argument. Because if you're invisible, no one knows that's you, then why wouldn't you do it, right? He's basically saying the only reason we do good things is because people are seeing us, right? Essentially, because there are benefits of being moral, for example, and and vice versa. So, in other words, if there are no consequences for your actions, then why wouldn't you steal and et cetera, or kill? That's what Glaucon is trying to argue here, right? That's what you have to prove. Um, and it's very interesting that this idea, you can see it in a letter from 1776 from Adams, to John Adams here. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. That's the same idea right here. All men would be tyrants if they could. So Glaucon is saying, look, people are bad, and then we create the social contract to prevent people from killing each other. Okay, and he's going to ask, Socrates, what's your answer to this? Before I tell you what Socrates' answer is, because it's the last vision of justice I want to talk about, I just want to make a short parenthesis here, okay? We'll talk about Adam's myth much later in the course, but just one parenthesis here. This image of Glaucon, of the individual being essentially selfish, right? Immoral, doesn't care about anyone, etc., is in stark contrast with Adam Smith. Okay, and this may be a little bit surprising, But that very question of what is the nature of the individual? Is the individual selfish or altruistic, or is the individual a blank slate? Right? Maybe we're completely neutral. We just is it nurture or nature? Right? Some people would say that we learn everything along the way, or some people would say we have certain characteristics, etc. Um, the whole course will always be talking about this idea of what is the morality of individuals. Well, some authors aren't very specific, right? Some will just say it's a blank slate, and then they'll just say it's all nature. I mean, sorry, it's all nurture, it's not nature. But here Glaucon is clearly saying that men are right. Men would be tyrants, and people are selfish, and it's the same as Thomas Hobbes, of course, homo homini lupus, right? So a man's a wolf to another man. They have this vision as of that man is not really altruistic at all, and that's very different from Adam Smith. So I just want to talk about this for a second. So you've heard about the invisible hand, right, in The Wealth of Nations. But Adam Smith has another book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, where his moral philosophy, where you find his moral philosophy. And there's this quite interesting passage where he says, though every man, according to the proverb, be the whole world to himself, though his own happiness may be of more importance to him than that of the world besides, in the race for wealth and honors and preferments, he may run as hard as he can and strain every nerve and every muscle in order to outstrip all his competitors. But if he should justle or throw down any of them, the indulgence of the spectators is entirely at an end. It is in violation of fair play, which they cannot admit. They readily, therefore, sympathize with the natural resentment of the injured, and the offender becomes the object of their hatred and indignation. Now, this is the one of the most important passages of the theory of the moral sentiments, my favorite passage, because I think it perfectly explains Adam Smith's notion of morality, right? So basically, these are because we always think of Adam Smith, and of course, we can't stop and talk about Adam Smith here a lot, but just to give you the why am I talking about this? We usually think of Smith as being this idea of the invisible hand, and people are selfish, and right as a forerunner of market societies and capitalism, etc. But and he obviously he wrote The Wealth of Nations, and the invisible hand is his concept, and that's true. But he didn't say that people were selfish or anything like that, as Glaucon would, right? And this passage shows that very clearly, because what he's saying is you should think about it as a race, right? In a race, so people may be the whole world to himself. So we may think more first about us, right? Then about other people, right? But look, and we may strain every nerve and muscle of our body, so we'll try very hard to win. But if you just though, right, or if you throw anyone down, the indulgence of the spectators is at an end. So it's a violation of fair play, which is unacceptable. So people do not accept violations of fair play, right? So the point here is when we act, there's this idea of an impartial spectator, which is analyzing our actions. So Adam Smith was saying essentially that people have an inherent sense of morality, and they do take into consideration upon taking their actions if they're violating social norms or not, if they're violating fair play or not. Okay. So Adam Smith is saying something very, very different from Glaucon and this idea that all men would be tyrants. But that's something we'll get back to later on our Adam Smith discussion. Now, just to go back to the question you asked, prove otherwise, Socrates, right? So that was the Glaucon's challenge, right? He gave this example of the ring. We would all use the ring, and so he says, the justice is good for its consequences, right? So the social contract the laws and that we establish are good for the consequence, because then we can have a stable society. But it's not good in itself, because if you could just one person, right? You could just one person break the law and not have to pay anything, right? Not go to jail, etc., then you right, then you wouldn't. So it's not desirable in itself just for its consequence. Um, and he wants Socrates to argue otherwise. So this will take the essentially the rest of the book, but I will tell you more or less what it is that he's going to argue. And obviously Socrates' answers is one of the funniest and most surprising, replies you could ever expect. You want to know what justice is? Let's build a city, right? It's basically what he says. He says, well, think about it. His argument is a bit weird, right? He's like, think about it. If there's a letter written on a wall and it's very small, it's very hard to read, right? That word because the letters are small. But if there was a huge wall and we painted a giant word, then we can see that word from far, from miles away very easily, isn't it? And it says, yes, yes, Rox, yes, indeed. And so he says, well, so finding what justice is on the individual level is very, very complicated. But if we build a city and if we can first understand what a just city is, perhaps then we can understand what a just individual is, right? Because of his metaphor of the wall, because it's easier to read, uh, a giant word in a giant wall than a tiny word in a tiny wall. So, pardon me. So we should build an ideal city, right? Which is just sounds a little bit surprising, and you're probably thinking, why? Why would he build the ideal city? What's the point here? And so what there are different interpretations, of course, but my understanding of you know Socrates arguing that we need to build the city to understand what justice is that ultimately Plato slash Socrates, they are arguing that it's impossible to have a moral individual in a world that is not moral. Let me just go back here 1 second because that's exactly what I was trying to show you here. Right? So this very first page, I went down to Pyrrhus and Polemarchus ordered his slave boy. Polemarchus orders you to wait. Polemarchus said, do you see how many of us there are, Socrates? Prove stronger than this man or stay. You have to fight for it, right? Either fight all of them or stay. Socrates, isn't there another possibility? Can't I persuade you? Are persuading you? And then Paul Marcus, could you persuade us if we don't listen? Glaucon says, it seems we must stay. Socrates says, that's how we must act. Okay, in a political society, right, in a city that is not just or ideal, individuals can't be just or virtuous either. That's the first page of the book that explains you the gist of it. Okay, getting back here to the that's what I was trying to explain earlier, and that's what Socrates is doing here. Okay, so why build the ideal city? Because if you build an ideal city, then uh, that wouldn't have happened what just happened to Socrates, right? There wouldn't be people coming up and say, prove stronger than us. And in an ideal city, there would be a police to protect you or whatever it is, right? I mean, at least the police is better than what they had back then, I guess, right? There wouldn't be that situation there, what we just saw. People coming with a militia and saying, come to my house, right? That doesn't happen anymore. Not in the United States, at least. And so, and so there it is, this idea that the city is connected to the soul, the man is the city, right? The soul and the city are connected. The political institutions are correlated to individual behavior. There's a feedback between both of them, right? So there's a vertical segregation and a horizontal segregation, if you will, like a two levels of orientation, right? So on the vertical level, you have the cave and this idea of learning and slowly learning your way from a young boy to a philosopher king, and then you will be one of the political authorities in the city, right? um And that relates, to religious themes, of course, the idea of going up, right? Going out of the cave and into the sun and going up is obviously, you see that everywhere. You see that in other religions as well, going up to the Sinai to, right, to receive the Torah or whatever. So going up, this is the idea here of going up and going down. There is an intellectual explanation of this, and you go up the hierarchy of this of society, of political society, but there's also a spiritual idea here, right, related up to being more virtuous, more just, right, and therefore. um, but yeah, you need to build the city with the proper political institutions so that individuals can, so that Socrates could be himself, right? So that individuals can be excellent and virtuous and just themselves. So everything in the book in the Republic is divided in three parts. That's also something we see in many places, right? The Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost is divided in three. Everything is divided in three. The alter ego, the if you look at Freud, right, at the egos of Freud, there are also three. Um, there's so many things that come in three. In the world, it's so interesting. I find. And here, everything in Plato's Republic is divided in three, as well. Um, so the city, which he uses the city as I mentioned before because it's the city state, but you can just think about it as the country, right? The United States, a country that's the equivalent, our modern equivalent to the city. But the city would be divided in guardians, auxiliaries, and producers. And the guardians are the philosophers, okay? The philosopher king or the philosopher queen or the guardians. They are the on top of society, and then you have the auxiliaries, which are the warriors. They protect the guardians, so they are the knights and the warriors, the military, and then the producers, everyone else, right, everyone who is producing, and yeah, Plato's idea is that the producers would end up being ignorant, as you will. They'll never see the essence of things. But on the other hand, they get to keep all the money because, funny enough, the guardians, who are the top of society, are not allowed even to touch gold. They cannot even touch it. Okay, they cannot accumulate wealth. They have to live like monks essentially, because otherwise, Plato thought money corrupts. So the political authorities, right, the leaders of society, they're the poorest ones. I mean, it's not that they live in poverty, but they cannot accumulate wealth. They'll never be millionaires or anything like that. So they basically, they'll be given a place to live and food. Obviously, they'll be taken care of and they'll have a normal, comfortable life, but they cannot buy anything. They're given everything. They can't even, they cannot have the experience of buying stuff throughout their lives. Since they're young, they're educated to become a philosopher, king, or a queen. So they'll never, ever have had access to money their whole lives because once you learn the taste of money or and buying stuff, you'll become a little bit corrupt. And then how can you be just and virtuous if you're thinking about money and not about what's better for society, right? Um, so that's a very, very unique characteristic of Plato that the elite, the political elite has no money, or not that has no money, right? But they live a simple life. They cannot accumulate money. Um, and the producers, they can accumulate money, but then they're intellectually lacking, right? They're just seeing the shadows and they're not understanding really what's um going on, beyond the veil of the material world. But the soul also would be divided in three parts, and so is the body. So you see here that the body is divided in there's the brain and the heart and the intestine, and that corresponds to the three parts of the soul, which is the rational, logical part, which relates to the brain, and then you have the emotions and the spirited part of the soul, which relates to the heart. Then you have the appetite and physical desires, relates to the intestine. So there are three parts of the body, there are three parts of the soul, and there are three parts of the city, right? The city is structured as three. As you'll see right now, there's going to be a correspondence between all these things. Okay. So the guardians will be related with a part of the body, the brain, which is related to rational and logical, right? Souls. Okay, so then the auxiliaries will be related to the heart and the emotions, right? They are loyal and they protect, the philosopher queens and queen kings, and the appetite, the physical desire, desire to eat, to have sex, to protect yourself, which is a part of the soul, but also is corresponds to a part of the body, and then is a social class, which is the producers, right? Is the producer will be allowed to earn money, as I mentioned. So greed, all of that stuff that's related to the intestine, etc. Right? But it doesn't end there because virtue is divided in three parts. And you're going to say three or four because there's something called four cardinal virtues, but it's actually three parts. So I'm going to explain. There are four cardinal virtues, but justice, which is one of the cardinal virtues, is actually a combination of the other three virtues. Okay, so what am I saying? That virtue really is divided in three parts, like everything else, namely wisdom, courage, and moderation. Okay, justice is not one of the virtues. Justice is when the different virtues are in harmony, are properly balanced. Okay. You see here this very, very ancient jar, and you see that it's painted a man with two horses, and this in ancient times was supposed to represent the three virtues here. So the man is supposed to represent, or the woman actually, it's probably, I'm not sure, but whatever it is, the person is supposed to represent wisdom, okay, and the horses are supposed to represent courage and moderation. So when wisdom is in control of, the same way the person here is controlling, you see, taming the other two. So when wisdom controls courage and moderation, you have justice. It's useless to be brave, very, very brave, right? Be very courageous if you're not wise, because you don't know when you should or shouldn't be courageous, or how much courageous you should be, right? You could exaggerate it, etc. And the same thing goes for moderation. So justice means that sometimes you need to be courageous, right? Sometimes you don't. You need to balance properly moderation, wisdom, and courage. So, right, measuring these three things at the right balance, that's what justice means. Okay. So there are four cardinal virtues, but okay, you sometimes you'll hear of four cardinal virtues, and you hear of these four virtues you see here, right? But in Plato, in the Republic, the way they think of thought about it was that virtue was divided in three parts because justice would be the final end point, right? The ultimate goal is justice. So that's balancing your different virtues to get there. And a very cool thing that I want to tell you here is that this idea of three virtues, right, and the is also represented in the three characters we've seen. So Glaucon, when Glaucon joins, there's this passage that says, "For Glaucon is always most courageous in everything." So Glaucon in the book is supposed to represent courage. I told you that the book is very well crafted, right? Um, Adamant is supposed to represent moderation because at one point he makes this argument, well, we should be, let's step down here, let's calm down, and let's analyze all of the arguments. He makes this argument that's an idea of moderation. And wisdom, guess who? Obviously, Socrates is supposed to represent wisdom, right? So Socrates, the encounter of the three characters supposed to represent the encounter of the three virtues, and then justice emerges from these three virtues getting together, and justice emerges from these three characters encountering in the Republic and exchanging ideas, and from their debate, they will finally understand what justice means, right? Now, Where else have you seen this in a very famous film, or um, maybe you read the book, but the idea that courage is represented by the lion because he doesn't have the heart. Remember that heart was that part of the body related to courage, right? The brain was that part of the body related to wisdom. So we have the scarecrow that doesn't have the brain. And then moderation would be the lack of emotions, isn't it? Doesn't have. So if justice is the encounter of the different virtues in the Wizard of Oz, what is Dorothy? She's supposed to represent. That's the Wizard of Oz is a you know they're completely inspired in the Republic. They're telling that story in a in a different way, in an easier way perhaps for you to understand. Than the Republic, but or for kids to understand than the Republic. But Dorothy, right? Um, she, she represents justice, right? Because she brings together the characters, she brings together the parts of the body, she brings everything in harmony, she brings the virtues together, right? And then the three of them, the lion and scarecrow and the 10 men, they will eventually, right, find the heart and the wisdom and the emotions that they're searching for, the guts, right, the courage, etc. um, and then you'll have justice as the result of that. So well, next time you ever watch this film or read a book, hopefully you'll have a different understanding of the book now that you know that it actually comes from the Republic. So yeah, two books we've seen today. Also, The Lord of the Rings, the idea of the ring of Gyges. But this, the Wizard of Oz, is also very, very clearly that's where it's coming from. So okay, so here you see and as I said, there are more things, right? There's also the body is divided in three, as I mentioned. There's also three vices. There's more things, but I just want to show you the whole thing we talked about here, and it's just so you can have the illustration of everything, right? So you have it's almost like a fractal, right? Because you have a triangle, right? You have the three things, but each one of these three is then divided in three are things it branches out. So it's a little bit like a structure of a fractal. But okay, not much to add here. It's just the image. And just to conclude here, we're getting to the very end. So what is the last vision of justice, or Socrates and Plato's vision of justice, right? Which is what you'd have to read the whole book to understand, but it's really about harmony, okay? This idea of everything being in its place. So I'll read you the quote: justice in the life and conduct of the state is possible only as first it resides in the hearts and souls of the citizens. You cannot have a just city without a just soul, and vice versa, okay? Individual behavior depends on the laws, right? If you're allowed, if there are no police, no laws, and etc., maybe you could commit some certain crimes, right? But since there are constraints and there are social norms, etc., you don't do these things. So the things you do depend on what everyone else is doing, isn't it? And that's what the city is, the political institutions, etc. So what is justice? A just city or a just soul is that would be Plato Socrates' answer. Is one where each part performs its appropriate function in harmony. So when everything is in its right place, that's justice, right? Guardians are guardians and they are using their reason, and auxiliaries, they are auxiliaries because they use their emotions, right? Like if you had a producer who was super smart and who was using her reason to produce, that's wrong. She was supposed to be a guardian, right? So when every person is allocated to the right class, and every organ of your body and every virtue and every part of your soul, when everything is in harmony, that's what justice is, right? That's it. Um, all right. And so it's related to this idea of being well ordered. Okay, you have order both on the soul, on the meaning on the individual level, and on the city, because the city is structured, in order, and you have hierarchy and everything works. All right, that's about it for the Republic, and I'll see you soon. Thank you very much.